The Vienna International Piano Competition was held every 3 years in the Grand Musikverein Concert Hall, a place where the greatest pianists in history had performed. The building itself was a masterpiece of architecture, with golden columns rising to ornate ceilings, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over rows of plush red velvet seats, and acoustics so perfect that every note played on stage could be heard with pristine clarity even in the furthest balcony. This was not a place for amateurs or casual musicians. This was where careers were made or broken, where prodigies came to prove themselves against the best young pianists from around the world. The competition had a reputation for being brutally selective. Only 60 pianists were invited to participate from the thousands who applied each cycle, and these 60 represented the cream of the crop from conservatories, music academies, and private instruction programs across 5 continents. The judges were always distinguished musicians themselves, often former competition winners or renowned concert pianists who had performed in the greatest halls of the world. To even receive an invitation to compete was considered a significant achievement. To place in the top 10 could launch an international career. On a cool morning in early October, the competitors began arriving for the preliminary round. The competition would span 5 days, starting with the preliminaries where each pianist would perform a 20-minute program of their choosing. From the 60 competitors, only 20 would advance to the semifinals. From those 20, just 6 would make it to the final round, where they would perform a full concerto with the Vienna Chamber Orchestra. The winner would receive a cash prize of €50,000, a recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon, and concert bookings at major venues across Europe and North America for the following season. The backstage area hummed with nervous energy as competitors warmed up in practice rooms, reviewed their sheet music one final time, or paced the hallways trying to manage their anxiety. These were serious musicians, most in their late teens or early 20s, who had spent their entire lives preparing for moments like this. Many had been playing piano since they were 3 or 4 years old, had studied with master teachers, had won regional and national competitions in their home countries. They understood the stakes. One exceptional performance could change everything. Among the competitors was Victor Ashford, a 24-year-old British pianist who had already made quite a name for himself in European classical music circles. He had studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London under one of the most respected pedagogues in the field, had won the Leeds International Piano Competition 2 years prior, and had performed as a soloist with several prestigious orchestras including the London Philharmonic and the Berlin Radio Symphony. Victor was tall and handsome with dark hair that fell stylishly across his forehead, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had been told his entire life that he was exceptional. Victor had reason to be confident. His technique was flawless, his interpretations were intellectually sophisticated, and he had that indefinable stage presence that made audiences sit up and pay attention. Critics described his playing as technically brilliant and musically mature beyond his years. He was scheduled to perform in the afternoon session of the second day, and he was widely considered one of the favorites to win the entire competition. As Victor waited in the green room between performances, reviewing the fingering for a particularly difficult passage in the Rachmaninoff piece he planned to perform, he chatted casually with other competitors. The atmosphere among the pianists was cordial but competitive. Everyone was friendly enough, but there was an underlying tension. They were all after the same prize, and only one person could win. A young woman named Sofia from Argentina was discussing the morning's performances. "Did you hear the German boy who played the Beethoven sonata? His control in the quiet passages was remarkable." Victor nodded absently, only half listening. He had heard the performance and thought it was competent but not particularly inspired. Too careful, not enough risk-taking. The kind of playing that was technically correct but emotionally cold. Another pianist, a serious-looking young man from South Korea named Jun, was studying the program booklet that listed all 60 competitors with their photographs and brief biographies. He suddenly laughed, a sound of genuine amusement mixed with disbelief. "Have you all seen this? There's a 12-year-old in the competition." Several heads turned. Victor looked up from his score. "A 12-year-old? That can't be right. The age minimum is usually 16 for this competition." Jun shook his head, still looking at the booklet. "It says right here, Emily Chen, age 12, from Vancouver, Canada. Student of," he squinted at the small print, "Dr. Margaret Foster at the Vancouver Academy of Music." Victor reached for the booklet and flipped to the page. Sure enough, there was a photograph of a small Asian girl with a round face, straight black hair cut in a simple bob, and large dark eyes that looked directly at the camera with an expression that was hard to read. She was wearing what looked like a school uniform in the photo. The biography was brief compared to the other competitors. Most entries detailed impressive competition wins, performances with youth orchestras, masterclasses with famous pianists, and acceptances to prestigious conservatories. Emily Chen's entry simply stated her age, her teacher's name, and noted that this was her first international competition. Her first international competition, and she starts with Vienna, Sophia said incredulously. That's either very brave or very foolish. This is not the place for someone to cut their teeth on competitive performance. Victor studied the photo more carefully. The girl looked even younger than 12, more like 9 or 10. She had that soft, unformed look that children have before adolescence begins to sharpen their features. It was almost absurd to imagine this child performing on the same stage where he and the other serious competitors would showcase years of advanced study and technical mastery. I'm sure she's talented for her age, Victor said, handing the booklet back to Jun. Child prodigies can be quite impressive playing simplified arrangements or easier repertoire. But at this level, he shook his head with a slight smile. She's going to be completely out of her depth. I almost feel sorry for her. Can you imagine being 12 years old and having to follow some of these performances? The comparison will be crushing. A few other pianists had gathered around to look at Emily's entry in the program. There was a general consensus that while it was cute that such a young child had been allowed to participate, she would obviously be eliminated in the preliminary round. Some wondered if perhaps she was the daughter of a wealthy donor who had pressured the competition organizers to include her. Others speculated that maybe the Canadian music education system had inflated standards and truly believed she was ready for this level of competition. When does she perform? Someone asked. Jun checked the schedule. Tomorrow morning, first session. She's actually the opening performer of the entire day. Victor laughed, a sound that was not entirely unkind, but definitely dismissive. Well, that's fitting, I suppose. Get the novelty act out of the way early, let the audience feel charmed by the adorable child prodigy, and then bring out the real pianists. It's good programming in a way. People always enjoy seeing talented children, even if the performance is not at a professional standard. What do you think she'll play? Sophia asked. Probably Mozart or early Beethoven, something appropriate for a child. Maybe some Chopin waltzes, another competitor suggested. Those are popular with young students who have decent technique. Victor closed his score and stretched his long fingers, flexing them to release tension. Whatever she plays, I'm sure it will be perfectly fine for a 12-year-old. Maybe she'll even win some regional competitions back in Canada based on participating here. But let's be realistic. She's just a kid. There's no way she can possibly compete with pianists who have been studying seriously for twice as long as she's been alive, who have the physical maturity to handle the technical demands of advanced repertoire, and who have the life experience to bring genuine emotional depth to their interpretations. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Victor found himself thinking about the young girl's photo. There had been something in her eyes, some quality of focus or determination that was unusual for such a young child. But he dismissed the thought. Determination was not enough at this level. This competition would require not just talent but technical mastery that took years to develop, physical stamina to execute demanding programs without mistakes, and artistic maturity that simply could not exist in a 12-year-old, no matter how gifted. Victor had been playing piano since he was 5 years old. He had spent countless hours every single day for nearly 2 decades practicing, studying, refining his technique under the guidance of world-class teachers. He had large hands that could easily stretch to reach difficult chord configurations. He had the physical strength to bring power to fortissimo passages and the control to execute the most delicate pianissimo phrases. He understood the historical context of the pieces he performed, the composer's intentions, the stylistic requirements of different musical periods. All of this had taken years to accumulate and synthesize. What could a 12-year-old possibly know about interpreting Rachmaninoff or Liszt? How could hands that small manage the technical demands of advanced repertoire? How could someone who had barely begun to experience life bring emotional authenticity to music that dealt with themes of love, loss, longing, triumph, and despair? It was, Victor thought, almost irresponsible of the girl's teacher to put her in this situation. She would perform tomorrow morning in front of an audience of sophisticated classical music lovers and 3 judges who had heard thousands of pianists and had impossibly high standards. When her performance inevitably fell short compared to the advanced competitors, it could damage her confidence and her relationship with music. Better to have waited a few more years, to have built up experience with smaller competitions, to have developed more fully both technically and artistically before attempting something at this level. But that was not Victor's concern. He had his own performance to focus on, his own career trajectory to manage. If the competition organizers had decided to include a child for whatever reason, that was their choice. It would not affect him one way or another. He would perform his Rachmaninoff tomorrow afternoon, deliver the kind of technically brilliant, emotionally compelling performance he was known for, and advance to the semifinals as expected. That evening, Victor had dinner with his former teacher, Professor Edmund Crawford, who had traveled from London to watch him compete. They ate at a quiet restaurant near the hotel where most competitors were staying, and Victor talked about his strategy for the competition, the pieces he had chosen for each round, and his observations about the other competitors. "There's a 12-year-old girl competing," Victor mentioned, almost as an amusing footnote. "Can you imagine? Someone thought it was a good idea to throw a child into this environment." Professor Crawford, a distinguished man in his 70s with white hair and penetrating blue eyes, raised his eyebrows. "A 12-year-old, that is unusual. Who is her teacher?" "Someone named Margaret Foster from Vancouver." Professor Crawford set down his wine glass, his expression thoughtful. "Margaret Foster, that name is familiar. I believe she studied with Leon Flesher at Peabody before moving to Canada. She was quite an accomplished pianist herself before she focused on teaching. If I'm thinking of the right person, she's not someone who would enter a student into an international competition frivolously." Victor shrugged. "Perhaps she overestimates her students' abilities. It happens. Teachers can become emotionally attached to talented students and lose objectivity about their actual level compared to the broader competitive landscape." "Perhaps," Professor Crawford said, but he looked unconvinced. "Or perhaps this child is genuinely extraordinary. True prodigies do exist, Victor. They're rare, but they do appear from time to time. Students who somehow bypass the normal developmental timeline and display abilities that seem impossible for their age." Victor respected his former teacher immensely, but on this point he disagreed. "I understand that prodigies exist, but this is the Vienna International Piano Competition, not a youth showcase. Even if she's remarkable for 12, she's competing against adults who have fully developed technique and artistic maturity. The gap is simply too large to bridge, no matter how talented she might be." Professor Crawford smiled slightly. "You may be right, but I think I'll make sure to attend the morning session tomorrow. I'm curious to hear what this child can do. And Victor," he added, his tone becoming more serious, "be careful not to let confidence turn into arrogance. The moment you believe you cannot be surprised is the moment you stop growing as a musician." The words were gentle but pointed, and Victor felt a flash of irritation. He was not being arrogant, simply realistic. There was a difference between confidence based on experience and objective assessment versus unfounded arrogance. But he did not argue with his mentor. Instead, he changed the subject to technical questions about his Rachmaninoff interpretation, and they spent the rest of dinner discussing musical phrasing and tempo choices. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Victor found himself pulling up the competition website on his laptop and looking at Emily Chen's entry again. The photo showed such an ordinary-looking child. There was nothing obviously exceptional about her appearance, no dramatic intensity or visible signs of genius. She looked like any other 12-year-old you might see at a shopping mall or a school playground. Victor clicked on the link to her biography, hoping for more information, but there was almost nothing there. Unlike most competitors who had extensive online presences with recordings of performances, competition results, and social media profiles documenting their musical journeys, Emily Chen had virtually no digital footprint. There were no YouTube videos of her playing, no competition results listed anywhere, no newspaper articles about a young prodigy from Vancouver. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, a complete unknown stepping onto one of the most prestigious stages in the classical music world. Victor found it baffling. How had she even been accepted into the competition with apparently no track record of previous achievements? The selection committee typically required extensive documentation of a pianist's experience and accomplishments before extending an invitation. He closed the laptop and prepared for bed, but sleep came slowly. Tomorrow he would perform, and based on everything he had heard so far from the other preliminary round performances, he was confident he would advance easily. The competition was strong, but nothing he had heard yet had particularly impressed or worried him. He had this. Still, as he finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of that photograph of the young girl with the serious eyes, and he felt the smallest flicker of something he could not quite identify. Not worry, certainly not. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the vague sense that something about this situation did not quite add up in the way he expected. Tomorrow morning, he would find out what the child prodigy could actually do. And then he was certain the mystery would be resolved. She would perform something age-appropriate and charming, the audience would applaud politely, the judges would give her encouraging feedback, and everyone would move on to the serious competitors. It would all make perfect sense. Victor Ashford had no idea how completely wrong he was about to be. The next morning arrived with a crispness in the air that was typical of Vienna in October. The Musikverein concert hall began filling up early, with audience members eager to secure good seats for the day's preliminary performances. The morning session would feature 12 pianists, starting at 9 o'clock and running until just after noon with brief intervals between performances. Victor had not initially planned to attend the morning session since his own performance was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. He preferred to spend the morning in focused preparation, running through difficult passages, doing technical exercises to warm up his fingers, and mentally rehearsing his interpretation. But something had drawn him to the concert hall anyway. Perhaps it was Professor Crawford's comment about not letting confidence turn into arrogance, or perhaps it was simple curiosity about the mysterious 12-year-old who had appeared in the competition with no apparent background or credentials. He arrived at the Musikverein just before 9 and slipped into a seat in the middle section of the hall, far enough back that he would not be conspicuous, but close enough to see the stage clearly. The hall was perhaps two-thirds full, a respectable audience for a preliminary round on a weekday morning. Many were family members and teachers of the competitors, but there were also serious classical music enthusiasts, competition regulars who attended every session to discover new talent, and music journalists covering the event. Professor Crawford was already seated a few rows ahead, and he turned when he noticed Victor entering. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement but did not seem surprised to see his former student there. Victor settled into his seat as the house lights began to dim. The competition director, a distinguished Austrian woman named Dr. Petra Zimmermann, walked onto the stage to offer brief welcoming remarks. She spoke about the long history of the Vienna International Piano Competition, the caliber of this year's applicants, and the distinguished panel of judges who would be evaluating the performances. The 3 judges took their seats at a table positioned in the center orchestra section. Maestro Alessandro Benedetti from Italy, a renowned conductor and pianist. Professor Yuki Tanaka from Japan, who taught at the Tokyo University of the Arts. And Dame Catherine Blackwood from England, a legendary pianist who had won this very competition 40 years earlier and had gone on to an illustrious international career. These were not people who would be easily impressed or swayed by sentimentality. They had heard the greatest pianists in the world and had impossibly high standards for technique, musicality, and artistic vision. Victor knew all 3 by reputation, and he respected their expertise. These were exactly the kind of judges who would see through any attempt to pass off a talented child as ready for serious professional consideration. Dr. Zimmermann finished her remarks and introduced the first performer. We begin this morning with Emily Chen, age 12, from Vancouver, Canada. Miss Chen will be performing Piano Sonata No. 23 in F minor, Opus 57, known as the Appassionata by Ludwig van Beethoven. Victor felt his eyebrows shoot up in surprise. Several people in the audience murmured in shock. The Appassionata was not a piece for children or even for most adult pianists. It was one of Beethoven's most technically demanding and emotionally complex works, requiring enormous physical stamina, flawless technique, mature interpretive vision, and the ability to sustain dramatic intensity across 3 movements spanning nearly 25 minutes. Professional pianists spent years mastering this piece. Many never performed it publicly because the risks were too great and the technical demands too severe. For a 12-year-old to attempt the Appassionata at an international competition was either extraordinarily bold or completely reckless. Victor leaned forward in his seat, his interest now fully engaged. This would either be a spectacular disaster or something genuinely remarkable. There was no middle ground with a piece like this. The stage remained empty for a moment, and then a small figure walked out from the wings. Emily Chen looked even tinier on the vast stage of the Musikverein than Victor had imagined. She was perhaps 4.5 feet tall, dressed simply in a black velvet dress that fell to her knees and black shoes that made almost no sound on the wooden stage floor. Her straight black hair was pulled back with a simple clip, revealing her young, serious face. She walked to the piano bench with steady, measured steps, showing no visible signs of nervousness or hesitation. When she reached the piano, she adjusted the bench height, a necessity given her small stature. Then she sat down, placed her hands briefly in her lap, and looked at the keyboard for several seconds. The audience waited in complete silence. Victor found himself holding his breath without quite knowing why. Emily lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. For one more heartbeat, she sat perfectly still, gathering herself. Then she began to play. The opening of the Appassionata is deceptively quiet, a mysterious rolling figure in the left hand under a simple melodic statement in the right. But from the very first notes, Victor knew something unexpected was happening. The sound Emily produced was not the thin, careful tone that young pianists typically managed. It was rich and resonant, each note perfectly weighted and balanced. Her hands moved with absolute certainty across the keys, the rolling left-hand figure flowing smoothly while the right hand shaped the melody with subtle dynamic shadings that revealed mature musical thinking. The opening section built gradually in intensity, and Emily navigated the increasing technical demands with apparent ease. Her small hands moved rapidly across the keyboard, executing runs and arpeggios with crystalline clarity. When the music exploded into the first dramatic fortissimo passage, Emily did not shy away from the power required. She brought genuine force to the chords, producing a sound that filled the enormous hall, yet even in these powerful moments, the tone never became harsh or banged. Every note was controlled and purposeful. Victor felt his mouth go dry. This was not a talented child playing beyond her years. This was something else entirely. The technical execution was at a professional level, the kind of playing that took most pianists well into their 20s to achieve. But what was even more startling was the interpretive maturity. Emily was not simply playing the notes correctly. She was shaping phrases with sophisticated understanding of the music's architecture, making subtle tempo adjustments that heightened dramatic tension, bringing out inner voices in the complex passages that most pianists missed entirely. As the first movement progressed through its development section, building to its fierce climax, Emily remained completely focused, her expression serious and concentrated but not strained. Her body moved naturally with the music, swaying slightly during lyrical passages, leaning into powerful chords, her small frame somehow generating enormous sound when needed. Watching her was like witnessing something that should not be physically possible, as if the normal rules of musical development simply did not apply to this child. The first movement concluded with thunderous force, the final chords hammered out with absolute conviction. Emily paused for just a moment before beginning the second movement, the variations marked andante con moto. This movement required a completely different quality, a sense of profound stillness and introspection. The theme was simple and hymn-like, but each subsequent variation demanded increasing technical facility combined with deep emotional sensitivity. Emily played the theme with touching simplicity, her tone now soft and luminous. As she moved through the variations, her hands executing increasingly elaborate figurations around the main melody, Victor found himself forgetting entirely that he was watching a 12-year-old. The playing transcended age or physical appearance. It was simply great pianism, the kind that communicated directly to the listener's emotions without the interference of conscious analysis. Around him, Victor sensed that the entire audience was spellbound. The normal subtle sounds of a concert audience, the small coughs, the slight rustling of programs, the shifting in seats had ceased entirely. Everyone was listening with complete attention, drawn into the world that Emily was creating through Beethoven's music. The second movement built to its own powerful climax before subsiding into ethereal quiet. Then, after the briefest pause, Emily launched into the final movement. The Allegro ma non troppo finale of the Appassionata is a perpetual motion tour de force, requiring the pianist to sustain driving rhythmic intensity across several minutes of relentlessly difficult passage work. It is physically exhausting even for adult pianists with large hands and fully developed technique. Emily attacked it with fearless energy. Her fingers flew across the keys, the rapid repeated notes crisp, and even the runs and scales perfectly articulated. The music hurtled forward with irresistible momentum, and Emily rode it like a surfer on a massive wave, always in control even as the technical demands became more and more extreme. There were passages where Victor, watching carefully, could see that her small hands simply could not stretch to reach certain intervals that an adult pianist would play easily. In these moments, Emily made lightning-fast adjustments, redistributing notes between hands or using pedal techniques to sustain certain tones while her hands moved to execute other passages. These were split-second decisions that required not just technical knowledge but deep understanding of the music's harmonic structure. The finale drove toward its conclusion with gathering force, the dramatic tension building to an almost unbearable level. Emily's hands hammered out the final thunderous chords, her entire small body behind each massive sonority. The final chord rang out into the hall, and Emily held it, letting it decay naturally into silence before lifting her hands from the keys. For perhaps 3 full seconds, the music vereen was completely silent. No one moved, no one breathed. The silence was so profound that Victor could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then the spell broke, and the audience exploded into applause. But this was not the polite, encouraging applause that greets a competent performance by a young student. This was thunderous, overwhelming, the kind of visceral response that happens when an audience has witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. People leapt to their feet, and within seconds the entire hall was standing, applauding with an intensity that Victor had rarely witnessed even at professional concerts by established artists. Victor found himself on his feet with everyone else, applauding without having consciously decided to stand. He felt stunned, almost dizzy, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. What he had just witnessed should not have been possible. A 12-year-old child had just delivered a performance of one of the most demanding works in the piano repertoire that was not just competent or impressive for her age. It was genuinely great playing by any standard, comparable to performances by mature professional pianists at the height of their powers. On stage, Emily stood and gave a simple, modest bow. She did not smile or show any outward emotion. Her face maintained that serious, focused expression, as if the standing ovation was simply what happened after you played the piano and was not particularly surprising or noteworthy. She bowed once more, then turned and walked off stage with the same measured, steady steps she had used to enter. The applause continued even after she had disappeared into the wings. The audience seemed unable to stop, as if by continuing to clap they could somehow process what they had just experienced. Finally, after what must have been 2 full minutes, the applause began to subside and people started to sit back down, but the energy in the hall had completely changed. Everyone was talking at once, voices raised in excitement and disbelief. Victor sank into his seat, his mind racing. He looked toward the judges' table and saw that all 3 judges were leaning together in intense conversation. Dame Catherine Blackwood looked particularly animated, gesturing expressively as she spoke with her colleagues. Professor Tanaka was writing furiously in her notes. Maestro Benedetti sat back in his chair with an expression of wonder on his face. Professor Crawford turned in his seat to look back at Victor. Their eyes met, and Victor saw something in his former teacher's expression that might have been gentle reproach mixed with amusement. The message was clear without words being spoken. I told you not to assume you could not be surprised. Around Victor, audience members were expressing their shock and amazement. Did you see how small her hands are? How did she even reach those passages? One woman was saying to her companion. An elderly man behind Victor was telling his wife, "In 40 years of attending concerts, I have never seen anything like that from someone so young." Victor sat in silence, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about musical development and piano performance. The technical mastery alone would have taken most pianists 15 or 20 years to achieve. The interpretive sophistication she had displayed suggested life experience and emotional depth that a 12-year-old simply should not possess. The remaining performances of the morning session passed in a blur for Victor. He sat in his seat, physically present but mentally elsewhere, still processing what he had witnessed. The other 11 pianists who performed that morning were talented and well-prepared, executing their chosen repertoire with varying degrees of success. Under normal circumstances, several of these performances would have been considered impressive. But following Emily Chen's Appassionata, everything else seemed diminished by comparison. A talented 17-year-old from France played Chopin's Ballade No. 4 with considerable skill, but his interpretation felt safe and predictable. A 20-year-old from South Korea delivered a technically brilliant performance of Prokofiev's 7th Sonata, but it lacked the emotional depth that made great playing transcendent. One after another, competent pianists demonstrated their abilities, and one after another, they seemed to fall short of something ineffable that Emily had possessed. During the interval between the morning and afternoon sessions, the lobby of the Musikverein buzzed with animated conversation. Everyone was talking about the 12-year-old girl who had opened the day with a performance that defied belief. Victor overheard snippets of conversation as he made his way through the crowd. "I've been coming to this competition for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that," an elderly woman was saying to a group of listeners who nodded in vigorous agreement. A music journalist was speaking rapidly into his phone. "You need to get someone here for the semi-finals. There's a 12-year-old who just played the Appassionata like she's been channeling Beethoven himself. This is going to be international news." 2 piano teachers were engaged in an intense discussion about how such a level of playing was even possible from someone so young. "The technical facility is one thing," one of them was saying, "but the interpretive maturity is what astounds me. Where does a child find that kind of emotional depth?" Victor spotted Professor Crawford near the entrance to the hall and made his way over. His former teacher looked at him with knowing eyes. "So," Professor Crawford said simply, "what are your thoughts?" Victor struggled to find words. "I don't understand what I just heard. That level of playing from a 12-year-old should not be possible." The physicality alone, leaving aside everything else, how can someone that small produce that quality of sound, sustain that level of technical execution for 25 minutes? Professor Crawford nodded thoughtfully. I confess I am equally mystified. I've taught for 45 years and thought I understood the developmental trajectory of pianists. What we just witnessed challenges every assumption I've held about how long it takes to develop true artistry. He paused, watching the crowd. The judges looked shell-shocked. I would not be surprised if this changes the entire dynamic of the competition. She'll advance to the semifinals, obviously, Victor said, though even as he spoke, he felt strange stating something so obvious. Of course she would advance. The question was not whether she would make it through preliminaries, but whether anyone else in the competition could possibly match what she had already demonstrated. Professor Crawford studied Victor carefully. How are you feeling about your own performance this afternoon? It was a perceptive question. Victor realized he felt unsettled in a way he had not anticipated. His carefully prepared Rachmaninoff program, which yesterday had seemed like a strong choice that would showcase his considerable abilities, now felt somehow insufficient. He was no longer comparing himself to the other adult competitors. He was thinking about a 12-year-old girl who had played with such authority and conviction that she had made some of the finest young pianists in the world seem ordinary by comparison. I feel like I need to raise my game, Victor admitted. Which is absurd because I'm already playing at the highest level I'm capable of. But somehow, after what we just heard, anything less than extraordinary seems inadequate. Well, that's not necessarily a bad mindset, Professor Crawford said, as long as it pushes you to dig deeper rather than making you second-guess yourself. You are a superb pianist, Victor. Don't forget that just because you've witnessed something remarkable. They parted ways as Victor headed backstage to prepare for his 2 o'clock performance. The backstage area was crowded with afternoon performers doing last-minute warm-ups and trying to manage their pre-performance anxiety. Victor found an empty practice room and spent 30 minutes running through the most technically demanding sections of his program. But his concentration kept wavering. His mind kept returning to images of Emily Chen's small hands flying across the keyboard, her serious young face completely absorbed in the music. When 2 o'clock arrived, Victor walked onto the stage of the Musikverein for his preliminary round performance. The hall was fuller than it had been in the morning, word having spread about the remarkable opening performance and drawing additional audience members for the afternoon session. Victor sat at the piano, took a moment to center himself, and began his program with the Rachmaninoff Prelude in G minor. He played well, his technique was flawless, his interpretation was sophisticated, and he brought considerable power and passion to the demanding Russian repertoire. The audience responded with strong applause, and when he finished his 20-minute program with a virtuosic showpiece, he received what would normally have been considered an excellent reception. Several people even stood to applaud. But Victor knew as he walked off stage that his performance, while technically excellent, had not generated the kind of electricity that Emily's had created. He had played all the right notes with proper technique and musical understanding. Yet something had been missing, some quality of revelation or transcendence that separated very good playing from the kind that left audiences breathless. In the days that followed, as the preliminary round continued and the field was narrowed from 60 competitors to 20 semifinalists, Emily Chen became the talk of the classical music world. Videos of her Appassionata performance, recorded by audience members on their phones, began circulating online despite the competition's strict no-recording policy. Within 48 hours, clips of her playing had been viewed millions of times. Classical music critics who had not attended the preliminaries began arriving in Vienna, not wanting to miss the semifinals and potentially the finals if this mysterious prodigy continued to advance. The semifinals were scheduled for 2 days, with 10 pianists performing each day. Each semifinalist would present a 40-minute program of their choosing, demonstrating breadth of repertoire and stylistic range. The stakes were higher now, with only 6 pianists advancing to the final round. Victor had made it through the preliminaries as expected, his excellent performance earning him a spot in the semifinals despite his own feeling that he had not reached the transcendent level he was capable of. As he prepared for his semifinal performance, he found himself thinking constantly about Emily and what she might perform next. Would she choose another monumental Beethoven work? Or would she demonstrate versatility by choosing repertoire from a different composer and era? The semifinals began, and Victor attended the first day of performances, even though he was not scheduled to play until the second day. Emily was the 5th performer on the first day. By the time she walked onto the stage, the Musikverein was completely packed. Every seat was filled, people were standing in the back, and the press section was overflowing with journalists and photographers, cameras ready despite the official restrictions. Dr. Zimmerman introduced Emily with noticeably more detail than she had in the preliminary round. Now the competition director mentioned that Emily had begun playing piano at age 4, had studied exclusively with Dr. Margaret Foster in Vancouver, and was homeschooled to allow for intensive musical training. The brief biography still revealed remarkably little about competition experience or public performances, but that hardly mattered now. Emily had announced herself to the classical music world in the most dramatic way possible. Emily walked onto the stage wearing a different dress, this one dark blue, but her demeanor was unchanged. She showed no sign of being affected by the enormous attention now focused on her, the packed hall, or the dozens of cameras pointed in her direction. She sat at the piano with the same quiet composure she had displayed in the preliminary round. "For my semi-final performance," Emily said in a clear young voice that nevertheless carried to every corner of the hall, "I will be playing selections from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, followed by Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit." A ripple of astonishment went through the audience. This was an extraordinary program choice. The Bach would demonstrate her ability to handle the crystalline clarity and contrapuntal complexity of Baroque keyboard music, requiring a completely different approach than the romantic grandeur of Beethoven. And Gaspard de la Nuit was legendary as one of the most technically difficult pieces in the entire piano repertoire, a work that Ravel had explicitly intended to be more difficult than Balakirov's Islami, which was itself considered nearly unplayable. The work consisted of 3 movements, each depicting a different fantastical or macabre scene. Ondine, a water nymph attempting to seduce a mortal, Le Gibbet, a hanged man swinging from a gallows, and Scarbo, a malevolent goblin. The piece demanded not just extraordinary technical facility, but also sophisticated coloristic imagination and the ability to create vivid atmospheric effects. Many professional pianists avoided programming Gaspard de la Nuit because of its notorious difficulty and the high risk of memory slips or technical breakdowns. Emily began with Bach, playing a prelude and fugue in C-sharp major from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. The contrast with her Beethoven performance could not have been greater. Where the Appassionata had been all drama and passion, the Bach was transparent and architectural. Emily's playing revealed the intricate interweaving of melodic lines with perfect clarity, each voice distinct yet balanced with the others. Her touch was light and articulate, the phrasing shaped with subtle inflections that gave the music breathing life without imposing inappropriate romantic expression on the Baroque style. She followed with another prelude and fugue, this time in B-flat minor from Book 2, demonstrating her understanding of the different character and increased complexity of Bach's later work. Her fingers executed the elaborate fugal passages with ease, bringing out the subject entrances clearly while maintaining the overall architectural logic of the composition. The Bach alone would have been an impressive demonstration of musical maturity, but it was merely the preparation for what followed. Emily paused after completing the second fugue, gathering herself for the formidable challenge ahead. Then she launched into Ondine, the first movement of Gaspard de la Nuit. The piece began with shimmering, flowing arpeggios that suggested water and movement. Emily's hands moved with liquid grace across the keys, creating cascades of notes that glittered and sparkled. The technical demands were immense, requiring rapid repeated notes, wide leaps, and complex rhythmic patterns executed at high speed, but Emily navigated it all with apparent effortlessness. More remarkably, she never allowed the technical difficulty to obscure the musical narrative. You could hear in her playing the seductive water nymph song, the sensuous beauty of the underwater realm, the mortal's resistance and final rejection of her advances. The second movement, Le Gibbet, was completely different. A single repeated note, B-flat, tolled throughout like a bell, marking the passing of time as the corpse swung from the gallows. Around this obsessive ostinato, Ravel wove eerie harmonies and ghostly melodic fragments. Emily played it with hypnotic intensity, the repeated note absolutely even in tone and timing, while her other fingers shaped the surrounding music into something genuinely unsettling. For 6 minutes she sustained this dark meditation on death, never losing concentration or allowing the relentless repetition to become mechanical. Then came Scarbo, and Victor, watching from his seat in the hall, found himself leaning forward in involuntary tension. Scarbo was the most technically demanding of the 3 movements. A diabolical scherzo depicting a malevolent goblin who appears and disappears, grows enormous and then tiny, terrorizes the narrator through a long night of supernatural horror. The music was explosive, violent, requiring the pianist to move from barely audible whispers to thunderous fortissimos in seconds, to execute runs and leaps at breakneck speed, to sustain complex polyrhythms and create a sense of chaos barely controlled. Emily attacked it with fearless intensity. Her hands flew across the keyboard with breathtaking speed, hammering out the violent outbursts, then suddenly pulling back to create moments of eerie quiet. The dynamic range she commanded was extraordinary, from sounds so soft they barely registered to massive chords that made the piano seem like it might explode. She played with a kind of possessed energy, completely immersed in the nightmarish world of Ravel's imagination. The movement built to its shattering climax, a series of savage repeated chords marked FFF, as loud and violent as the piano could produce. Emily threw her entire body weight behind each chord, her small frame generating enormous power. Then suddenly it was over. The final fragmentary figure disappeared into silence, the goblin vanishing as mysteriously as he had appeared. For a moment, the audience sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then the applause erupted, even more overwhelming than it had been after the Appassionata. This time people were not just applauding, they were shouting, cheering, weeping. Dame Catherine Blackwood, the legendary pianist serving as a judge, was openly crying. Professor Tanaka had her hands pressed to her face in an expression of pure wonder. Maestro Benedetti was on his feet, applauding with his hands raised high above his head. Victor sat frozen in his seat, his hands slowly clapping in automatic response but his mind reeling. What Emily had just done was beyond his ability to fully comprehend. Gaspard de la Nuit was a piece that separated good pianists from great ones. Professional concert artists prepared for months before daring to perform it publicly, and even then, technical breakdowns were common. Memory slips, missed notes, rhythmic problems, these were almost expected given the work's extreme difficulty. Emily had played it flawlessly. More than flawlessly, she had played it with complete musical conviction, creating a vivid narrative that held the audience spellbound despite the technical fireworks. She had not merely executed difficult passages correctly. She had made music of the highest order, bringing to life Ravel's dark fantasies with playing that was both technically perfect and emotionally devastating. Around Victor, the audience continued their ovation, refusing to stop even as Dr. Zimmerman tried to take the stage to introduce the next performer. Emily had returned for 3 bows, and still the applause continued. Finally, after nearly 5 minutes, the cheering began to subside, and Emily left the stage for the final time, her face still showing that same serious, composed expression, as if this overwhelming response was simply what happened when you shared music with people. The remaining performers on the first day of semifinals faced an impossible situation. Several were exceptionally talented pianists who delivered impressive performances of challenging repertoire. But how could anyone follow what Emily had done? It was not simply that she was technically brilliant or musically mature. It was the combination of her extreme youth with a level of artistry that seemed to transcend normal categories of evaluation. She was not a great 12-year-old pianist. She was simply a great pianist, period, who happened to be 12 years old. That evening, Victor sat in his hotel room, supposedly preparing for his own semi-final performance the next day. But he found himself unable to concentrate. He kept replaying Emily's performance in his mind, trying to understand not just how she did what she did, but why it affected him so profoundly. Part of it was simple shock at witnessing abilities that seemed impossible. But there was something deeper, something that made him question his own relationship with music and performance. Victor had always been driven by ambition. He wanted to win competitions, secure prestigious concert bookings, build a major international career. He practiced obsessively, studied scores analytically, worked with his teacher to polish every interpretive detail. His approach to music was fundamentally about mastery and achievement, and it had served him well. He had won competitions, performed with excellent orchestras, received positive reviews. But watching Emily play, Victor recognized something that had been missing from his own music making. She did not seem to be trying to impress anyone or prove anything. There was no sense of ego or performance in her playing. Instead, she seemed to simply be sharing something that lived inside her, communicating directly from her inner world to the listener's heart without the interference of self-consciousness or ambition. When had Victor lost that quality? Or had he ever possessed it? He tried to remember being young, first falling in love with piano, playing simply because the music moved him rather than because he wanted to achieve something. The memories were distant, overlaid with years of competitive training, technical drills, strategic repertoire choices designed to showcase his abilities to maximum effect. Victor's semi-final performance the next afternoon was technically flawless. He played a demanding program that included Liszt's Mephisto Waltz and Brahms' Variations on a Theme by Paganini, both pieces that demonstrated his virtuosic capabilities and musical sophistication. The audience applauded enthusiastically and the judges gave him high marks. He advanced to the finals as expected. But Victor knew with a clarity that was almost painful that his performance had not touched the level that Emily had reached. He had played brilliantly, but he had not transcended the mechanics of performance to create the kind of communion with the audience that Emily achieved effortlessly. The realization was humbling in a way Victor had never experienced before. The 6 finalists were announced that evening. Emily Chen, age 12 from Canada, Victor Ashford, age 24 from the United Kingdom, Meilin Zhang, age 19 from China, Dmitry Volkov, age 22 from Russia, Akiko Yamamoto, age 20 from Japan, and Lucas Hoffman, age 23 from Germany. These were the best young pianists from the entire competition, each bringing exceptional abilities and artistry to the final round. The finals would take place over 2 evenings, with 3 pianists performing each night. Each finalist would play a complete piano concerto with the Vienna Chamber Orchestra, conducted by Maestro Benedetti. The concerto was the ultimate test of a pianist's abilities, requiring not just solo virtuosity, but the capacity to collaborate with an ensemble, to balance and blend with orchestral textures, to sustain concentration and musical narrative across the extended time span of a multi-movement work. The draw for performance order took place the morning after the semi-final results were announced. Victor drew the second position on the first evening, right after Dmitry Volkov and immediately before Emily Chen. The order felt both fortunate and terrifying. Performing right before Emily meant direct comparison was inevitable, but at least he would not have to follow her. Each finalist had submitted their concerto choice weeks earlier before the competition began. Victor had chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, universally recognized as one of the most technically demanding concertos in the repertoire. It was a piece that had served him well in previous competitions, showcasing his powerful technique and romantic interpretive style. Dmitry Volkov would be playing Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 3, a work of motoristic brilliance and sardonic wit. Emily Chen had chosen Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 24 in C minor. When Victor learned Emily's concerto choice, he felt a mixture of surprise and strategic understanding. The Mozart C minor concerto was indeed a masterpiece, one of the composer's most dramatic and emotionally complex works. But it was not a piece that overwhelmed with technical display. Unlike the Rachmaninoff or Prokofiev concertos, which gave pianists opportunities to demonstrate virtuosic fireworks, the Mozart required something subtler. Perfect balance, impeccable taste, profound sensitivity to the dialogue between piano and orchestra, and the ability to convey deep emotion through classical restraint. It was a brilliant choice for Emily, Victor realized. If she had chosen a big romantic concerto, critics could have argued that her teacher had strategically selected repertoire to show off her unusual abilities. But Mozart could not be faked. It revealed everything, every imperfection of touch, every lapse in musical judgment, every failure of stylistic understanding. For a 12-year-old to attempt one of Mozart's mature concertos in a competition of this level was either supreme confidence or extraordinary courage. The 3 days before the finals were filled with rehearsals. Each finalist had 2 90-minute rehearsal sessions with the Vienna Chamber Orchestra to prepare their concerto. Victor attended his first rehearsal with excitement and some nervousness. Working with an orchestra was different from solo performance. You had to listen constantly, adjusting your playing to balance with the ensemble, following the conductor's interpretive decisions, navigating the complex coordination required to make piano and orchestra function as a unified musical entity. Maestro Benedetti was a demanding collaborator who had strong ideas about interpretation and expected the soloists to engage in genuine dialogue rather than simply executing their prepared versions. Victor's rehearsals went well, though Benedetti pushed him to listen more carefully to the orchestral voices and to allow more flexibility in his tempos. "You play brilliantly," the conductor told him at one point, "but you must trust the orchestra more. Music is a conversation, not a monologue." Victor was finishing his second rehearsal when Emily arrived for her first one. She walked into the hall carrying her music and looking impossibly small beside the full orchestra. Victor decided to stay and watch, curious about how she would handle the challenge of working with professional musicians who were all at least twice her age. Maestro Benedetti greeted Emily warmly, bending down slightly to shake her hand. "Miss Chen, I have been looking forward to working with you. Your Mozart selection is a beautiful choice. Shall we begin with the first movement?" Emily nodded and walked to the piano. The orchestra members, who had been chatting during the break between rehearsals, grew quiet as they watched the tiny 12-year-old sit at the concert grand. Victor could see skepticism on some faces, curiosity on others. These were professional musicians who had performed with renowned soloists. What could they possibly expect from a child? Maestro Benedetti raised his baton, and the orchestra began the opening tutti section of the Mozart concerto. The music was dark and dramatic, the C minor tonality suggesting tragic depths. When Emily's entrance arrived, she came in with perfect timing and immediately established herself as a musical equal to the orchestra. Her tone blended beautifully with the orchestral strings. Her phrasing matched the conductor's conception, and she navigated the intricate dialogue between piano and orchestra with sophisticated awareness. Maestro Benedetti stopped them after a few minutes to discuss a technical coordination issue, and Victor watched the conductor's face transform from professional courtesy to genuine excitement. "Yes, exactly like that," Benedetti was saying to Emily. "You understand that the piano in this passage is not the soloist but part of the conversation with the winds. Perfect." The rehearsal continued, and Victor found himself completely absorbed. Watching Emily work with the orchestra revealed yet another dimension of her artistry. She was not just a brilliant solo pianist. She was a complete musician who understood ensemble playing, who listened attentively to what the orchestra was doing, who adjusted her playing moment by moment to serve the music rather than dominate it. At one point, Benedetti stopped to suggest a different tempo for the second movement. "I hear this as more flowing, less of a strict tempo. What do you think, Miss Chen?" Victor had never heard a conductor ask a 12-year-old soloist for their interpretive opinion. But Maestro Benedetti was treating Emily as a colleague, genuinely interested in her musical perspective. Emily considered for a moment, then played a phrase with the suggested tempo. "Yes," she said simply, "that feels more natural. May we try it with the orchestra?" They worked through the entire concerto, stopping frequently to refine details, adjust balances, discuss interpretive choices. By the end of the 90 minutes, the orchestra members were looking at Emily with undisguised respect. Several smiled at her warmly as she gathered her music to leave. The principal violinist, a woman in her 50s who had played with some of the greatest artists in the world, stopped Emily on her way out. "That was a pleasure, my dear," she said. "I look forward to the performance." Victor left the hall feeling thoughtful. He had just witnessed something that confirmed what he had been slowly realizing throughout the competition. Emily Chen was not a novelty or a curiosity. She was the real thing, a musician of depth and maturity who happened to inhabit the body of a child. The age gap that had seemed so insurmountable when Victor first learned of her participation now seemed almost irrelevant. When Emily played, you forgot about her age entirely. You simply heard great music making. The evening of the first finals concert arrived. The Musikverein was filled beyond capacity, with people standing wherever space could be found. The international press was out in force. Television cameras had been set up to broadcast the concert live across Europe. The Vienna International Piano Competition had always been prestigious, but this particular finals had captured global attention in a way that no piano competition had in decades. Everyone wanted to witness the phenomenon of Emily Chen performing in the finals at age 12. Backstage, Victor could feel the electricity in the air. This was no longer just a competition. It had become a major cultural event. Dmitry Volkov, the Russian pianist who would perform first, was pacing nervously. Victor sat quietly, trying to center himself and focus on his own performance. Emily was nowhere to be seen, presumably in one of the private green rooms, staying calm before her performance. The concert began, and Dmitry delivered a powerful performance of the Prokofiev Third Concerto. His technique was spectacular, the rapid octave passages and pounding rhythms executed with machine-like precision. The audience responded with strong applause, recognizing the exceptional technical mastery on display. It was the kind of performance that would have been a highlight of any competition finals. Then came Victor's turn. He walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, sat at the piano, and nodded to Maestro Benedetti that he was ready. The orchestra began the opening of the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto, and Victor entered at the piano's first statement of the famous melody. Victor played with everything he had. The Rachmaninoff Third was a piece he had lived with for years, and he knew every note, every harmonic shift, every opportunity for expressive shaping. His fingers navigated the treacherous technical obstacles with confidence born of countless hours of practice. The famous cadenza in the first movement, where pianists traditionally chose between Rachmaninoff's original version and the more difficult Asha passage, Victor played the Asha with blazing virtuosity, executing the rapid double notes and intricate figurations with impressive accuracy. The slow movement showcased his lyrical playing, the long singing lines shaped with genuine feeling. And the finale was a tour de force of stamina and brilliance, the relentless technical demands dispatched with apparent ease. When the final chords thundered out and the orchestra held the final tutti, Victor felt the satisfaction of having delivered a performance that represented the best he was capable of. He had played with technical mastery and emotional commitment, bringing all his years of training and experience to bear on one of the repertoire's most challenging works. The audience responded with a prolonged standing ovation. People cheered and shouted bravos. The applause went on for several minutes and Victor took multiple bows, genuinely moved by the reception. This was the kind of response that won competitions, that launched careers. As he walked off stage, Victor allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps, despite everything, he could still win this competition. But then came Emily Chen. She walked onto the stage looking even smaller than usual next to the full orchestra spread across the stage. The audience's applause when she appeared was already overwhelming, people on their feet before she had even reached the piano. She waited patiently for the noise to subside, then sat at the piano bench, adjusted it slightly, and folded her hands in her lap as she waited for silence. Maestro Benedetti raised his baton, and the Vienna Chamber Orchestra began the opening statement of Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 24 in C minor. The mood was immediately different from the romantic grandeur of Victor's Rachmaninoff or the motoristic energy of Dmitri's Prokofiev. This was classical-era music, restrained in its expression, refined in its textures, but containing depths of emotion that were all the more powerful for being contained within elegant formal structures. Emily's first entrance was perfectly judged, her tone blending seamlessly with the orchestral texture. From the opening phrases, it was clear that something special was happening. This was not a child trying to sound mature. This was not technical brilliance masking musical shallowness. This was music-making of the highest order, technically immaculate but more importantly, profoundly musical. The first movement of the Mozart C minor concerto alternated between dark, minor-key drama and fleeting moments of major-key hope. Emily navigated these emotional shifts with exquisite sensitivity, her touch producing a palette of tonal colors that made the relatively simple melodic lines seem infinitely expressive. In the dialogue passages between piano and orchestra, she responded to the orchestral phrases as if engaged in actual conversation, her timing and inflection giving the impression of spontaneous communication rather than rehearsed coordination. When the first movement cadenza arrived, the section where the orchestra drops out and the pianist plays alone, Emily delivered playing of breathtaking beauty. Mozart's cadenzas for this concerto are relatively short and simple compared to later romantic concerti, but they require perfect control and refined taste. Every note Emily played was ideally weighted, every phrase shaped with natural breathing logic, every ornament executed with casual grace. There was no showing off, no attempt to impress with virtuosity. Instead, there was simply honest, direct communication of Mozart's musical ideas. The second movement was even more remarkable. Marked larghetto, it was one of Mozart's most sublime creations, a flowing melody of heartbreaking beauty supported by pizzicato strings. This was music that required maturity beyond technique, the ability to sustain a long melodic line with subtle inflections that conveyed deep feeling without sentimentality. How could a 12-year-old possibly understand the adult emotions this music expressed, the longing and resignation and bittersweet acceptance of life's sorrows? Yet Emily played it with such profound sincerity that the question of her age became meaningless. The slow movement unfolded with natural inevitability, each phrase growing organically from what preceded it. Her tone was luminous and warm, the melody singing with an almost vocal quality. Orchestra members who had to hold long sustained notes found tears running down their faces as they played, moved by the beauty of what they were participating in creating. When the final movement began with its agitated minor key theme, Emily brought appropriate dramatic intensity while maintaining classical restraint. This was not romantic excess, but rather contained passion, emotion channeled through elegant formal structures. The technical challenges of the movement, including rapid scale passages and intricate coordination with the orchestra, were dispatched effortlessly, but always in service of the musical narrative. As the concerto moved toward its conclusion, Victor realized he was witnessing a performance for the ages. This was not simply one of the best performances of the competition. This was one of the finest performances of Mozart's C minor concerto that he had ever heard, from a pianist of any age. The combination of technical perfection, stylistic understanding, and emotional depth was extraordinary. But what elevated it beyond even that was the sense of complete authenticity. Emily was not performing the concerto. She was living inside it, sharing its emotional world with total honesty and directness. The final chord sounded, and for a moment the entire music vereen was completely silent. It was as if the audience, the orchestra, even Maestro Benedetti were suspended in the emotional space that Emily had created, reluctant to break the spell by returning to ordinary reality. Then the applause began, and it was unlike anything Victor had ever experienced at a classical music performance. People were not just applauding. They were weeping, laughing, shouting, hugging strangers seated next to them. The ovation went on, wave after wave of sound washing over the small figure standing at the piano. Emily bowed to the audience, then turned to bow to the orchestra, acknowledging them as partners in what had just occurred. The orchestra members were standing and applauding her, an extraordinary gesture of respect from professional musicians to a young colleague who had just demonstrated what true artistry looked like. Backstage, Victor stood with the other performers and competition staff, all of them watching on the monitor as the ovation continued. Dmitry Volkov stood beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. "I have never seen anything like that," Dmitry said quietly. "I played well tonight, perhaps the best I have ever played that Prokofiev. You played magnificently. But what she just did, that is something that happens once in a lifetime if you are lucky enough to witness it." Victor nodded, unable to find words. He felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was disappointment, certainly the recognition that he would not win this competition. But more than that, there was awe and gratitude. He had just witnessed something genuinely transcendent. A reminder of what music could be when ego and ambition fell away and only honest communication remained. The ovation finally subsided after nearly 10 minutes and Emily left the stage. She came backstage looking calm and composed, her dress slightly damp with perspiration from the physical exertion of performing, but her face showing no particular excitement or satisfaction. Dr. Margaret Foster, her teacher, was waiting and embraced her student warmly. Victor could hear the teacher saying, "You were wonderful, Emily. I am so proud of you." Emily nodded seriously, "Thank you." I felt like I could really hear what the orchestra was doing tonight. The second movement especially felt right. It was such a simple, almost technical observation, the kind of thing any serious musician might say after a performance. But there was something about hearing it from a 12-year-old that made Victor smile despite his complicated feelings. She was still a child in many ways, just a young person who loved music and took it seriously. The fact that she happened to be a generational talent was almost beside the point. The second evening of finals featured the 3 remaining contestants. By this point, the outcome seemed almost predetermined to everyone following the competition. Emily's Mozart had been so extraordinary that it was difficult to imagine the judges choosing anyone else as the winner. Still, the 3 remaining pianists delivered impressive performances. Mei-Lin Zhang played Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 2 with poetic sensitivity. Akiko Yamamoto brought crystalline clarity to Ravel's Piano Concerto in G. Lucas Hoffman delivered a powerful account of Brahms' Piano Concerto No. 2. All 3 were excellent musicians who under normal circumstances would have been serious contenders for the top prize. But these were not normal circumstances. They were competing in the same finals as Emily Chen, and that changed everything. The awards ceremony took place the following evening. The Musikverein was once again filled to capacity, with media presence even more overwhelming than during the finals performances. The announcement of results at major piano competitions was typically a formal affair with polite applause for each award. This time felt more like a rock concert, with audiences buzzing with anticipatory energy. The judges took the stage first. Dame Catherine Blackwood spoke for the panel, her voice carrying the weight of decades of musical experience. The jury wishes to acknowledge that this has been an exceptional competition. The level of playing throughout has been extraordinarily high, and we have had the privilege of hearing remarkable performances from extraordinarily talented young musicians. She paused and the audience leaned forward. In the history of this competition, which spans over 60 years, we have never faced a decision quite like the one we faced this year. The jury was unanimous in our final decision, but I want to emphasize that we believe several of the finalists could have won this competition in any other year. Dame Catherine looked out at the audience. Before announcing the winners, I want to say something about the nature of artistic achievement. Competitions are necessary evils in the classical music world. They provide opportunities and launch careers. But they also create false hierarchies, suggesting that one performance is definitively better than another when in truth, art cannot be so simply quantified. What we have witnessed over these past days has reminded us that occasionally, very rarely, we encounter a talent so exceptional that it transcends the normal categories by which we evaluate musicians. She paused again, and Victor, sitting in the audience next to Professor Crawford, knew what was coming. The third prize goes to Dmitry Volkov from Russia. The second prize goes to Victor Ashford from the United Kingdom. The audience applauded as Dmitri and Victor came to the stage to receive their awards. Victor shook hands with the judges, accepted his certificate and prize, and returned to his seat feeling genuinely grateful. Second prize at the Vienna International Piano Competition was a significant achievement that would benefit his career. He had played well, perhaps better than he ever had. There was no shame in being bested by what he had witnessed. Dame Catherine continued. The first prize, and with it the gold medal recording contract and concert series, goes to Emily Chen from Canada. The audience erupted before she could finish the sentence. The ovation was deafening, people on their feet, cheering as if at a sporting event. Emily walked to the stage looking serious and small, and when Dame Catherine bent down to place the gold medal around her neck, the contrast in their sizes created a striking visual image that would appear in newspapers around the world. Dame Catherine waited for the noise to subside before continuing. I want to add something personal. I have been judging piano competitions for 30 years. I have heard thousands of talented young pianists. Very rarely, perhaps 3 or 4 times in my career, I have heard something that made me remember why I fell in love with music in the first place. Emily Chen's performances this week have been a gift to everyone fortunate enough to hear them. This is not simply a talented child. This is a major artist at the beginning of what I believe will be one of the most important musical careers of this generation. More applause, even more overwhelming than before. Emily stood holding her medal, and for the first time since Victor had first seen her, she smiled. It was a small, slightly shy smile, but it transformed her serious face into something more childlike, a reminder that underneath the extraordinary artistry was still a 12-year-old girl. The reception following the awards ceremony was crowded with well-wishers, media representatives, and music industry professionals all hoping to speak with Emily. Victor watched from a distance as she was surrounded by people offering congratulations, interview requests, and concert bookings. Dr. Foster stood protectively nearby, fielding questions and ensuring her young student was not overwhelmed. Professor Crawford found Victor near the refreshments table. "How are you feeling?" his former teacher asked gently. Victor considered the question honestly. "Surprisingly all right," he said. "I mean, obviously I wanted to win, but losing to that," he gestured toward where Emily stood surrounded by admirers, "there's no dishonor in that. What she did was beyond category." Professor Crawford nodded approvingly. "That is a mature perspective, and I am glad to hear it. You played magnificently, Victor. Your Rachmaninoff was as fine as I have ever heard you perform. Do not let this experience diminish your confidence in your own considerable abilities." "I won't," Victor said, "but I think this experience has taught me something important. I've been so focused on winning, on building a career, on demonstrating my technical mastery. Watching Emily, I remembered that music is supposed to be about communication, about sharing something true and beautiful with listeners. She does that naturally without self-consciousness. I need to find my way back to that kind of honesty in my playing." They talked for a while longer, and then Victor decided to leave the reception. As he was heading toward the exit, he passed near where Emily was standing with her teacher. On impulse, Victor stopped. "Miss Chen," he said, "might I have a word?" Emily looked up at him with those serious dark eyes. Up close, she looked even younger than she appeared from a distance. "Of course, Mr. Ashford, your Rachmaninoff was beautiful. I especially loved how you shaped the second theme in the first movement." Victor was startled that she had not only heard his performance but had formed specific musical opinions about it. "Thank you. I wanted to tell you that your playing this week has been extraordinary. Your Mozart especially was one of the finest performances I have ever heard." Emily's cheeks colored slightly. "That is very kind. I love that concerto. Mozart is my favorite composer." "May I ask you something?" Victor said. "When you play, how do you find that depth of emotional expression? You are so young and yet you play with such maturity. How is that possible?" Emily considered the question seriously. "I do not think about being young or mature when I play. I just think about what the music is trying to say. Mozart was sad when he wrote that concerto. You can hear it in every phrase. I do not have to have experienced exactly what he experienced to understand sadness or longing or hope. Those feelings are universal. Music is just the language we use to express them." It was such a simple answer, yet profound in its directness. Victor realized that he had been overcomplicating music for years, approaching it intellectually and analytically, when sometimes the most direct emotional response was also the truest. "Thank you," he said. "I think you have just taught me something important." Emily smiled that small, shy smile again. "I hope we perform together sometime. I would love to play four-hand repertoire with you." The idea of this 12-year-old treating him as a musical peer, suggesting they collaborate as equals, would have seemed absurd just a week ago. Now it seemed perfectly natural. "I would be honored," Victor said sincerely. "Natural." "I would be honored," Victor said sincerely. In the weeks and months following the Vienna International Piano Competition, Emily Chen's name became known far beyond the classical music world. Her performances were discussed in mainstream media outlets, analyzed by music critics, and shared millions of times on social media. The recording contract she had won as part of her prize resulted in an album of Mozart piano concertos that would go on to become one of the best-selling classical recordings of the decade. Concert halls around the world competed to book her for performances. Major orchestras wanted to collaborate with the young phenomenon. Music conservatories invited her to give masterclasses, an ironic situation that found the 12-year-old offering guidance to students twice her age or more. Dr. Margaret Foster, Emily's teacher, was careful to protect her young student from being exploited or overwhelmed. They accepted only a limited number of concert engagements, ensuring Emily had time for normal childhood activities and continued education. In interviews, Dr. Foster emphasized that Emily was still a developing musician, still learning, still growing. The extraordinary abilities she displayed were not a finished product, but rather an early bloom of talent that needed careful nurturing. For Victor Ashford, the competition marked a turning point in his approach to music. The second-place finish at Vienna, far from being a disappointment, proved beneficial for his career. Concert bookings increased, and he was invited to perform with several excellent orchestras. But more importantly, his playing began to change. He focused less on technical display and more on honest musical communication. Reviews of his performances began using words like heartfelt and sincere alongside the descriptions of his technical prowess. 6 months after the competition, Victor was performing in Vancouver and contacted Dr. Foster to ask if he might visit. She invited him to her studio, and he arrived to find Emily working through a Schubert sonata. He listened from the doorway as she played, once again struck by the mature musicality in the young girl's performance. When the lesson concluded, Emily greeted Victor warmly, and they spent an hour talking about music. She asked him technical questions about executing certain passage work in pieces she was learning. He found himself discussing musical interpretation with her as he would with any serious musician. Their conversation ranging from harmonic analysis to philosophical questions about what different composers were trying to express through their music. Before he left, Emily played for him the piece she was preparing for her next major performance, Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 4, one of the composer's most profound works. Her interpretation was still developing, she explained, and she would welcome his thoughts. Victor listened, and once again found himself moved almost to tears by the beauty and honesty of her playing. "It's extraordinary," he told her when she finished. "You bring such truth to everything you play. I think that is your greatest gift, not the technical facility, though that is remarkable. Not even the musical maturity, though that is unprecedented for someone your age. It is the absolute honesty and lack of pretense in your playing. You are not trying to be anything other than what you are, and that authenticity is what makes your performances so powerful." Emily thought about this. "I think music is too important to pretend," she said simply. "When I play, I am sharing something I love with people who also love it. Why would I be anything but honest about that?" The years passed, and Emily Chen's career unfolded in remarkable ways. She did not burn out or fade as some child prodigies had. Instead, she continued developing as an artist, her playing growing deeper and more nuanced as she matured. By her late teens, she was recognized as one of the finest pianists in the world, performing with major orchestras and in prestigious concert halls globally. She never forgot the Vienna International Piano Competition, the event that had introduced her to the world. Years later, when she was asked to serve as a judge for the competition, she accepted immediately. Sitting at the judges' table, now a young woman of 25, she watched a new generation of talented young pianists compete for the same prize she had won. On the first day of preliminaries, a 16-year-old boy from South America performed Chopin with exceptional sensitivity. During the judges' deliberation, one of the other judges expressed doubt about the boy's readiness for the semifinals, suggesting his technical facility was not quite at the required level. Emily spoke up gently. "I hear what you are saying about the technical aspects, but did you notice the musical intelligence in his phrasing? The way he shaped the nocturne especially showed real understanding. Technical facility can be developed with time and practice. But genuine musical sensitivity, that quality of hearing the emotional content beneath the notes, that is much rarer and more valuable." The judges discussed further and ultimately advanced the boy to the semifinals, where he delivered an even stronger performance. He did not win the competition, but he received enough attention to launch a successful career. After the competition concluded, the boy approached Emily to thank her. "I heard you advocated for me to advance," he said. I am grateful for that faith in my potential. Emily smiled. Someone once gave me a chance when they could have dismissed me as too young or too inexperienced. I remember what that felt like. Music is not about finding reasons to exclude people. It is about recognizing genuine talent and artistry wherever it appears, even when it does not fit our preconceptions about who a musician should be or what path they should have followed to get there. Victor Ashford, now in his mid-30s and a well-established concert pianist himself, had also been invited to judge that year's competition. He and Emily had remained friends over the years, occasionally performing together and always enjoying the rare opportunity to discuss music with someone who understood it at the deepest level. On the final evening, after the awards had been presented and the winners celebrated, Victor and Emily found themselves alone for a moment in one of the Musicverein's elegant side rooms. Through the doorway, they could hear the reception continuing, young pianists celebrating or consoling each other, teachers proud of their students, music lovers enthusiastic about what they had heard. "Do you ever think about that competition, the one where we first met?" Victor asked. "When you were 12 and shocked the entire classical music world?" Emily laughed softly. "Sometimes. I remember being so focused on the music that I did not fully understand why everyone was reacting so strongly. I was just doing what I loved, what felt natural to me. All the attention was strange." "I was such an arrogant fool," Victor said, shaking his head at the memory. "I actually said, 'She's just a kid,' and laughed at the very idea that you could compete with the rest of us. You taught me a profound lesson about humility, and about not underestimating people based on superficial factors like age or appearance." "You were not a fool," Emily said kindly. "You were just operating with assumptions that most people shared. The truth is, musical ability does not follow a neat developmental timeline. Some people bloom early, others late. Some follow traditional paths through conservatories and competitions, others find their own way. What matters is the music itself, whether we can touch something true and beautiful and share it with others." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two musicians who had traveled very different paths to arrive at similar destinations. The sound of Mozart drifted in from the reception, someone playing the opening of the C minor concerto on a piano in the adjacent room. "That is the piece that changed everything," Emily said, listening to the familiar melody. "I had no idea when I chose it that it would have such an impact. I just loved the music and wanted to share it." "And you did," Victor said. "You shared it so beautifully that you changed how I thought about music, how I approached performance. In some ways, that competition was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though I did not win. It taught me what really matters." Emily turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think really matters?" Victor considered the question carefully. "Honesty, courage, the willingness to be vulnerable enough to share your true self through music. Technical mastery is important, but it is just the vehicle. What we are really doing when we perform is offering our hearts to strangers and trusting that they will receive the gift in the spirit it is offered. You understood that at 12 years old. It took me longer to learn." "We all learn at different paces," Emily said with a smile. "That is what makes it interesting." They returned to the reception together, two pianists among many, each at different stages of their journeys but united by their love of music and their commitment to sharing it as honestly and beautifully as they could. The Musicverein's golden hall glowed warm in the evening light, and somewhere in the distance, someone was playing scales, the fundamental building blocks of music, preparing for tomorrow's practice or next week's performance or some day's triumph. The boy who had laughed and dismissed the 12-year-old girl had learned to listen. The girl who had simply wanted to share beautiful music had taught him, along with thousands of others, that true artistry transcends age, expectation, and preconception. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes genius announces itself not with fanfare, but with the quiet, honest voice of someone who has something true to say and the courage to say it. Years later, when people asked Victor Ashford about the turning point in his career, he always mentioned the Vienna International Piano Competition, where he placed second. "I was fortunate enough," he would say, "to compete against Emily Chen when she was 12 years old. She taught me what music could be when played with complete honesty and lack of pretense. That lesson was worth more than any first prize." And when people asked Emily Chen about her memories of that same competition, the one that launched her extraordinary career, she always spoke warmly of the experience. "I met wonderful musicians there," she would say, "people who took me seriously as a fellow artist despite my age." That kind of respect and recognition, that willingness to listen to the music rather than make assumptions about the musician, that is what the classical music world should aspire to. The story of the pianist who laughed at the idea of a 12-year-old competitor only to be left stunned by her extraordinary artistry, became part of classical music lore. But the real story was deeper than that simple narrative. It was about how genuine talent deserves recognition regardless of age or background, how assumptions limit our ability to appreciate excellence, and how music, at its best, transcends all categories and speaks directly to the human heart. The little girl who walked onto the Musikverein stage carrying the weight of decades of doubt and dismissal had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone fortunate enough to witness her gift. And in doing so, she had reminded the musical world of something essential and easily forgotten. That artistry knows no age, genius recognizes no boundaries, and sometimes the most profound truths come from the most unexpected sources.